Gallup and the Council on Competitiveness, with the support of Philip Morris International, present Restoring Trust in Uncertain Times. Here's your host, Carrie Sheffield.
How do you restore trust in uncertain times? Building and maintaining trust is always important for any organization, but in the middle of a global pandemic and an economic crisis, with unrest on the rise in cities across America, it is especially challenging. Relationships with employees, suppliers, customers, shareholders, and even the press are being reshaped, all during a time when good information is scarce and the future uncertain. How leaders respond to these challenges will shape how organizations are going to fare long into the future. Today, we're going to talk about trust with a focus on today's unique circumstances. First, we are going to talk with Professor David Miller, Director of the Faith and Work Initiative at Princeton University. Next, we will hear from polling expert Mohamed Younis of Gallup Research and Deborah Wince-Smith, President of the Council on Competitiveness. And then we will get some practical insights from Marine Corps General and U.S. Congressman Jack Bergman. I'm Carrie Sheffield, and this is Restoring Trust in Uncertain Times. My first guest is David Miller, who joins us from Princeton University. Hi, David.
Hey, Carrie, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you. David, you have a very interesting career path, having been both in the corporate world for 16 years, in international business and finance, and then becoming an academic looking at religion and ethics in business. You wrote this fascinating paper called Once Trust is Lost, Can It Be Restored? That you presented at the Davos Forum last winter. But I want to start in the present. How do you think that the coronavirus outbreak has changed the way that institutions think about establishing and maintaining trust?
Well, gosh, two important parts to your question, both establishing and then maintaining. The working assumption is that they started with trust, but in many times organizations don't. So then there's a reestablishment. We also have those who started with trust and they lose it, they breach it. So right now, as a citizen, I look to say, well, who do I believe? Is it the CDC? Who do I trust? Is it the CDC? Is it the White House? Is it the FDA? Is it scientists from one country or another country? It's extremely difficult to know who to trust, even institutions that historically have been trustworthy.
Well, David, it's interesting you mentioned all these institutions. We're going to get into this later with the editor-in-chief of Gallup, and his team looked at some of these major institutions and how the public perceives them in the wake of the coronavirus. And the media, my organization, scored dead last, unfortunately, out of these 12 groups. So in light of this, what advice would you give to the media about how to restore trust here in the coronavirus?
How much time do we have? Well, I mean, let's be frank. We know most media outlets have a certain bent or a certain orientation. They're playing to certain target audiences. I think one of the best things that even if you're playing to a target audience is to be truthful. You have to start with being truthful. So if you're going to tell a story, you have to tell the whole story, even if your target audience doesn't like it or doesn't fit their ideology or their politics. But that's a tough thing to do. So I think first it's a top-down decision. Does the owner of the network or the social media outlet or the entity which is in charge, do they really want to cultivate trust? Do they really want to be transparent? Do they really want to inform people fully of what's going on in a news story? Sometimes the answer, I think, is no, because if the facts get in the way, if the truth gets in the way of their opinion, left or right, they don't want to let people know it.
Thank you, David, for that advice to editors and producers. I hope they're all listening right now. But I want to take a step back and have you talk a bit more about your paper in general. What was the genesis for the paper? What were you hoping to find? Why did you do it? And why now?
Right. Well, I'll tell you a story, and it's also in part full disclosure. So I'm an independent external ethics advisor to a number of large multinationals in the space of ethics, covering a number of things, one of whom is Philip Morris International. I was having lunch in New York with some of their senior executives who had come over from Switzerland, and we got talking about the issue of trust. And they were frustrated because they think they've changed their business model and they're doing a lot of things differently with reduced risk products and so forth. And said, but people just don't trust us. And I said, well, fair enough. Your industry sector has had a pretty rough rough problem with trust over the past several decades. But they said, well, what would you advise us on that? And I said, well, first of all, always tell the truth is a good starting point. But I said, after that, we might be able to learn something from religious traditions, at which point everyone dropped their fork and said, what are you talking about? And I said, well, if there's one thing religious traditions, plural, are really good at, it's dealing with breach of trust, whether you've sort of sinned against God, quote unquote, or your neighbor, your spouse, or whomever it might be, another organization. They offer a pathway back to healing, a pathway back to getting whole again. And maybe you can't always rebuild trust or restore trust, but at least rebuild it. So we did research with over 20 scholars from every continent in the world, male, female, black, white, brown, from the three Abrahamic traditions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam, and asked, in your tradition, how do you think about restoration of trust? And we found a lot of wisdom and insights from these, and a large Venn diagram overlap of similar thoughts, and came up with my colleague Michael Tate and I, a fellow scholar with me at Princeton. We wrote a paper called Towards a Restoration of Trust, Insights and Lessons from Wisdom Traditions. And we came up with 11 theses or 11 proposals or 11 ideas that aren't necessarily sequential in nature, maybe a little bit, but we think that some or all of them might be relevant to the corporate world and to institutional life and not just to our personal life. Let me just accent, it's not about religiosity, the paper. It's not about what you believe, whether it's right or wrong, but an acknowledgement that a lot of wisdom exists in these amazing religious traditions which have been around for several thousand years in some cases, from which we might be well to learn a couple of things. It's a fresh way of looking at a seemingly intractable problem, restoration of trust.
So there are many dimensions to this, but I want to start with customers. There was an interesting piece in New York Magazine. It was titled, "Only You Can Reopen the Economy." It says in part, quote, "Governors can permit the economy to reopen, but only the people can reopen the economy. Commerce will only happen if people agree to engage in it, and they will continue to engage in much less of it as usual, so long as they feel it is not safe to go out in public," close quote. So David, in light of this, how and when does an organization stay on the right side of this decision? Every action has a risk and a reward, but how does a company, for example, approach decisions that may have fundamental health and safety consequences for its customers?
Right. Well, it's particularly difficult for corporations or other large institutions. It could be universities, like I work for a university. It could be nonprofits and so forth. But focusing just in the corporate world for a minute, it's a tough decision because, again, you don't know who to trust. If you have 5 scientists in a room, you seem to get 5 opinions. Different branches of the government say different things. Can you really trust any information coming out of China? I mean, these are real hard questions. I think what I see and what I advise companies is to set up some guiding principles. Find 3 or 4 guiding principles, ideally principles which are in tension with each other, to help make sure that you're thinking of all sides and all opinions and not just your own short-term best interest. One of the ways you might think about this document that we presented at Davos on behalf of, I was commissioned, as you know, full disclosure, by Philip Morris International to pose this question of trust and how do we restore it once it's been broken. And companies have to think about that now because some are starting from a place of distrust before they even get out the door.
So David, yes, we are focusing on the coronavirus, but I do want to bring in current events right now. With the protests that we've seen in the tragic death, in the wake of the tragic death of George Floyd, we're seeing many peaceful protests. We're also seeing some violent riots, property damage, and murdering of police, stabbings of police, and calls to defund the police. So, David, what can businesses, but also governments, police, other institutions, how can these institutions regain trust at such a chaotic time here in the country?
Well, I've been nonstop on the phone or various video channels these past really 3 or 4 days on this very question. Yesterday, I was in a conference call that had about 200 CEOs convened by the Yale CEO Summit, and everyone was talking about how do I do this? How do I restore trust? How do I do this? And one of the themes which came out, and it's one of the themes in our paper, is transparent practices. So to the extent you could be legally as fully transparent as possible, I think the police forces need to do that, as well as the different people protesting against that. Let's also remember that these recent protests are really the sum these are not new issues. These have been going on for a couple hundred years, and there's just a heightened intensity in the recent situation with George Floyd. What I've seen some amazing things in Coral Gables. I'm right now in South Florida right now in the Miami area. The police force got together with protesters and they knelt. They honored each other. The police recognized there's a difference between bad apple police, bad cops, and bad police forces in general. As one of my friends said, if a doctor messes up on a surgery with you, all doctors aren't bad all of a sudden. It's that one doctor that you sue for malpractice. And sadly, I think the police are being painted with a broad brush, that it's all police. Well, no, it's some bad, really bad offices and officers where there's a bad culture, which leads us to the next thing. This is about culture. This is about culture. So police forces need to do a hard internal look as to where are the healthy parts of our culture, where the toxic parts. And what this paper showed, looking at some of these wisdom traditions, as we call them, we looked at various religious traditions for insights and lessons, and they all talk about practices. Sort of there's a path back to healing. So if you had injured your neighbor, injured someone in your life, or injured God or offended God with your behavior, so to speak, what can we learn from these religious communities about a pathway back to healing and wholeness? And a lot of that would apply to the different police forces of admitting if you've made a mistake, not covering up, not hiding, the blue wall of silence people talk about. But equally, those who have been injured, they have a responsibility too, and that comes out in this literature and these stories that we read of a willingness to try to find a mutual path towards healing. It's not easy, but there are models and ways to do that.
So, David, another issue, and it has come up with several organizations, is the perception that a company or organization may be exploiting the crisis for its own gain at the expense of its stakeholders or the public. This could be as blatant as price gouging, or it could be in the political sphere, using the pandemic as a justification to advance what may be long-held goals. How does the leader keep this in balance? That is, how do you survive or even do well during a crisis without crossing the line into exploitation?
Yeah, it's a great point. In fact, I'm sure same thing in the media. If you try to find a story on anything other than the protests or the virus, like a lot's going on in the world right now, around the world as well as in our country. And so how do we avoid this temptation of exploiting it? To be fair, I think guiding principles of existing companies should teach them not to exploit. If anything, maybe to go to the extra yard to help society, to not take advantage of an opportunity that's in front of them. One of the CEOs I spent some time with, we talk about a lot of these issues. He mentioned 3 stages, and I think it's a healthy way to think about. First, there's a stage of sort of triage, like, wow, this hit everybody, blindsided everybody. It shouldn't have, but it did. So how do you triage, figure out what to do within your business? Second, after you've found a way to survive, then you need to think about, okay, this is the new normal, and how do we work during this new normal? Like you and I are doing this by video. We're not in person. I'm not in your studio. And then the third thing is, what are the new opportunities that come out of it? So you look at your core values that you have as an organization and keep using those as the measuring stick. What do you stand for as an institution? And if you stand for treating people with dignity, with respect, operating with integrity, having transparent practices, thinking of the common good and not just your own shareholder good. To be sure, I want companies to be hugely profitable, but I want them, it's how they're profitable. And I want them to do it in a way that is respectful of their employees and their various constituencies. There is a way to do it. Sadly, we've seen examples where there's been abuse.
Now, David, as you mentioned earlier, your paper lists 11 principles for restoring trust. And we don't have time to go into all of them, although I do encourage our viewers to do that. But I want to talk today about number 6. And it calls for what you call movement away from a contractual mindset to a covenantal mindset, which, according to my interpretation, I think means that trust isn't about letter of the law or coloring within the lines of a contract so narrowly. It's something more broad. It might be the spirit of the law. But what did you mean by this?
Well, you just nailed it. You should have written the paper instead of me. No, I mean, that's it. One of the great things we see in religious traditions, and we focused on the 3 Abrahamic traditions, asking what does Judaism, Christianity, Islam have to say about these questions of restoration of trust. And one quick point, we learned that, frankly, you can't restore trust, but you could rebuild trust, which means you remember. You don't forget the stuff that's happened. You learn from it. And in a lot of this literature, we saw common across these traditions and others that we didn't include in the paper for just scale and time reasons. A covenant is when there's a handshake, when it's a relational, not a transactional kind of a relationship between two parties, where there's more invested in it than just your immediate gain. It's long-term, it's the spirit of the law, not the letter of the law, and it's a sense of mutuality. It's a relational, not a transactional engagement. And that's a whole different way of thinking about it, because you're freer then to be self-critical. Wow, I dropped the ball. I really hurt you. I didn't mean to. I'm sorry. How do I make you whole? And the person on the other side, while it's harder to be the offendee, not the offender, how do you allow a path back to forgiveness and restoration? So it's there's a beautiful mutuality to it.
Well, David, what you said reminded me of my friend. He's a pastor, Rev Anthony Thompson. He's down in Charleston, South Carolina. And very tragically, his wife was murdered by white supremacists. So both Anthony and his late wife are African American. And a white supremacist went to their church and opened fire and killed his wife along with 8 other African Americans. And he wrote an amazing book, which I recommend to everyone. It's called Called to Forgive. And it walks through how he was able to forgive this murderer. But his book makes the distinction between what he calls forgiveness and reconciliation, that it really is a 2-step process. He says that godly forgiveness is unconditional forgiveness, but then the second step of reconciliation, that is conditional, and it's really conditional on the behavior of the person who has done the injuring. So how would you recommend someone who has done a grave offense or has ruptured trust can go to that second step of getting this conditional reconciliation?
Yeah, so one is you have to begin, if you've been so fortunate as to be forgiven by the offending party, you have to real quickly, and ideally in a mutual sense, not just on your own, because sometimes we might misread what we need to do. We have good intentions, but we just don't understand the depth of the problem or the depth of our transgression. So the first is to enter into a conversation with the offended party or parties, really learn and listen to what the issues are. And then you could begin having almost using sort of religious language, a conversion, where you have a new mindset. You think about it differently. Instead of we, they, it's an us situation. And then you ask, well, what are new practices that we can cultivate so that this doesn't happen again? So you move from a conceptual relational forgiveness, and then you take action, demonstrable, provable, consistent action over time to show that you've changed your patterns. And there will be slips, there will be trips. It's not a linear process, but this idea of cultivating practices. In fact, one of the practices we talked about was self-care and other care. We think a lot about taking care of the other person, but what about taking care of ourselves? Sometimes it's very hard to work for an organization which has done something terribly wrong. There's a lot of grief and sadness within the company. The organization's not proud. So how do you come out of that? And there's a lot of pathways to doing this.
So David, in the discussion questions at the end of your article, you use a term that I think is very revealing about how you view organizations. You talk about what you call an institutional consciousness. It's a really interesting phrase because we tend to think of organizations as having cultures, as you said earlier, or norms, but not necessarily consciousness per se. So in this particular moment where leaders may be facing existential questions for their organizations, be it bankruptcy, layoffs, furloughs, and the like, is this concept particularly useful and applicable? Or is it all about survival until we get to whatever the new normal is?
Well, I think survival and institutional consciousness are not in opposition. They're words that should be in the same sentence and in the same mind of those institutions of how do you survive in an appropriate, healthy way. Like one company, Barry Waymiller out in the St. Louis public domain knowledge, during the 2008-2009 crisis, the way they handled it without doing any furloughs or any layoffs, and I think they're doing the same thing now, is by having shared furloughs, and people who could afford to have a longer furlough would swap with those who couldn't. So there was ways in reduction of salary for top earners. They did a number, put practices in place. It was an institutional consciousness that said, we want to treat our people with humanity, and we're all going to be in this together. So there was a collegial way of doing it. There was a team spirit or an institutional consciousness. So if we look at whether it's issues with the protests against George Floyd and other racist behaviors, or if it's a company trying to struggle with getting back on its feet after the virus has decimated its revenue lines, I think you can get back in a way that's consistent with your conscience. And that means the leadership team, the CEO, the board, the executive suite need to be saying, who are we as an organization? And maybe we have to declare bankruptcy. I mean, maybe you do have to fold your cards, but even then, how do you do it in a way that is aligned with your consciousness, your value set? And I think people can do it very hard, and it will very painful. But to lose your conscience is a very sad thing.
So, David, once I heard of this concept of institutional consciousness, I immediately heard of a book that I like and recommend to everyone. It's called Conscious Capitalism by John Mackey, who is the founder of Whole Foods, and you may know. And it's the same idea of being conscious and how you're applying your capitalism. I hope that you get your paper in front of this community, the conscious capitalism community. I think they'd love it. And again, I recommend it also to all of our viewers to make sure to check out your research. It's been a pleasure to have you, Dr. David Miller.
Well, thank you. It's been a delight to be with you, and I'm just really glad you're helping facilitate this conversation. It's an important one.
Thank you. Stay safe out there.
All right. Take care.
Thank you again, David. I want to turn now to our next two guests. Deborah Wince-Smith is president of the Council on Competitiveness, which brings CEOs, university presidents, and labor leaders together to keep American business competitive in the global market. We also have Mohamed Younis. He is editor-in-chief at Gallup, where he oversees the global news team. Mohamed, let me start with you. We just heard from David Miller about how leaders can approach restoring trust, but I'm looking for a sort of baseline assessment of where we are today on that issue. That is, how has the COVID crisis changed people's trust in institutions? I'm thinking business, the branches of government, and the media.
Absolutely. So we have been asking Americans, amidst many other things, how they approve of the job of various actors within the crisis. Interestingly, and I think particularly of note to this audience, is that local and private actors actually fare much better than nationally elected leaders in terms of getting a higher approval rating. For example, the highest approval ratings really went to hospitals in one's local area and U.S. hospitals generally. Interestingly, 89% of Americans approve of the response their employer has had to the crisis. 87% approve of their child's school or daycare. State government also fares relatively well. 78% approve of how their state government is handling, as well as state health institutions. It's not until you get to Congress and President Trump that you really see that divide again erupt in the data. 48% have approved of the job Congress has done, which is actually a relative high based on our polling. And about 50% have approved of the job President Trump himself has done. The lowest ratings have gone to the media, and 41% of Americans approve of how they've been handling the crisis itself. So to kind of sum it up, I think the crisis has only accentuated and highlighted what we've already known about Americans and trust in institutions. Americans tend to trust local institutions, and they trust private sector actors, particularly small business, than they do national political figures and institutions.
So, well, that certainly fits the adage of all politics is local. But it's interesting you mentioned that the media was rock bottom, and that's something that I've looked at as a person in the media myself. What is driving, based on your research, that low rock bottom approval among all those 12 institutions, low trust in the media?
It's interesting. We've seen a decline in sort of going back to 2015, in a divergence, or not a decline, but an increase in divergence between Republicans and Democrats on their attitudes of the media. On a national level, just to give you context, when we were polling in the time of President Nixon's impeachment, 7 in 10 Americans said they had confidence in the honesty of the media they had access to in the United States. Today, only 4 in 10 Americans say the same. So there's been a general decline. That decline is most pronounced among Republicans, like I said, in the past 5 years or so. But as of now, 41% of independents approve of the job the media has done in the COVID crisis, which is exactly the national average. 68% of Democrats share that view, and only 16% of Republicans as well. So there is definitely a partisan angle to that.
And what do you think is driving that partisan split?
So, actually, we have a whole project where we're trying to understand what that is, and we're currently running an online sociology experiment, basically, to understand people's news consumption. Overall, what we found is that people, again, similarly to government, want to trust and want access to local news sources and see them dwindling away across the United States. People have more trust in local news as well. So what I'm saying is, on a national level, what we find is that people trust local news more than sort of the national news offerings. In terms of the partisan divide, that question really comes to the fore when we just ask about trust in the news generally, in the honesty of media. It's not surprising, I think, that Republicans would take that position, being that the president has had a really contentious relationship with the media. But it's not just about sort of President Trump. Like I said, this is a long-term decline. And it coincides with, I think, what's interesting from a business perspective, what has been documented, which is the disappearance of local news organizations into what are larger national or international conglomerate syndicates that maybe are not as focused on local issues.
Very interesting. Deborah, I want to bring you into this. So some things will go back to normal when this passes, the coronavirus passes, the pandemic part of it anyway, but some things won't go back to normal. Your members are going to have to adjust. So take just one example from Gallup's polling. It said that 62% of employed adults are now working from home. And of those, fully half now say that they would prefer to work from home even after the epidemic passes. Deborah, how do you get workers to trust that it is safe to return? Or will businesses be forced to adjust to a permanent new reality?
Well, that whole issue of trust in the workplace and in all our daily activities, of course, has been brought into full focus now with the global pandemic. And before I answer that, I would like to make a comment, if I may, on the last discussion with Mo, because I think what we've also seen in the decline in the overall trust of media is how technology and the innovation that has been unleashed with social media and multiple sources of information and data has really upended the traditional media industry. So that's actually, just like in any technological revolution and change, there's a great side to it. I mean, we wouldn't be able to be working and doing what we're doing without the internet and these new tools. But on the other side, there's a dark side to it. It's going to be how we reach balance, I think, through trust and verification that we get to a new place. But back to your question about, the new normal and not the new normal. I think, interestingly, that we're seeing a lot of productivity enhancement through working remotely. And I'll just share an example. Yesterday, the Council on Competitiveness had a fantastic meeting with over 40 of our university president members. Senator Mark Warner from my state of Virginia participated with us for an hour and a half. And a lot of the discussion, of course, was about how to resume hybrid models of higher education. But we could have never had that type of a conversation and gathering so efficiently and bringing people from around the country if we were just hoping we get everybody to fly to Washington to do that in our headquarters. So that's one example of the positive changes that are coming, with working remotely. And of course, universities, have their mission of education and research and spurring entrepreneurship, but they're also businesses. And they've realized collectively they have to be able to assure their customers, their clients, students, faculty, families, the community, that they can operate in a safe and sustainable way. So I find it fascinating that in all the businesses, universities are really out in the forefront of developing both the processes, but also the tools and developing the trust to ensure, yes, we're going to open and we're going to be able to deliver our core education and research in a safe, sustainable way. And they also realize that if they can't provide that trust and surety to their community, many of them will go out of business.
Can I, Carrie, can I just add to a point that Deborah made that's so important? A lot of what we track also, in addition to kind of social attitudes and behaviors is what's happening in the workplace. And we've been tracking that in this crisis unfolding through our panel data here in the United States. And what Deborah said is exactly panned out by the data. What we've noticed is that employee engagement has actually held on very steadily, if not increased in some industries in the United States as this crisis has unfolded, at a time when a lot of the data on financial metrics, of course, are devastating and concerning. We can get into those, but it is really noticeable that at a time of severe difficulty, those who are employed seem to be doubling down more than ever, at least here in the workspace. The other point I've been contemplating is, what is this sort of flattening of the technology now bringing in terms of opportunities to tap into talent all over the world? Deborah gave a great example of people who often maybe wouldn't have the time to meet. Organizations, employers can potentially now use this as an opportunity to tap into talent pools more effectively, where it's not really required for people to sort of migrate from a low income economy to a developing economy. So I think their implications for this are vast and are only going to play out as generations sort of deal with the realities that are up ahead.
Yeah, I agree with that.
So Deborah, I want to pick up on something that you mentioned in terms of, you were talking about the adaptation for geographic cohesion using technology and Zoom to have this remote conference that probably wouldn't have happened, the same collection of people, if you were seeking everyone to come here to the Beltway, the swamp, as some folks like to call it. Do you think that this provides an opportunity maybe to increase trust, maybe paradoxically, because people will be more conscious of digital inclusion, and maybe people including people in conversations across geographic lines that perhaps weren't communicating?
Absolutely. And you know, I'm the president of our sister organization, the Global Federation of Competitiveness Councils, and we've had every week now a fantastic global conversation with leaders from around the world. We have about 7 leaders each week from different parts of the world, different organizations, around what they're doing in their own respective nations and regions to both deal with the pandemic, but very importantly, what are going to be the strategies to recover and prosper and grow. And it's just become a must-to event every week, and it's continually expanding the participants and the people that are online. So I'm very, very optimistic that we're going to see far more inclusion in people's learning and ability from throughout the world, and also some of the partnerships that are being formed. I mean, just yesterday, a young woman from Uruguay who said, I had to move to Singapore to start a company I was working on, but now I wish I hadn't, because I could certainly do it back from my home in Uruguay and be with my family. So these are very, very positive developments, and I agree that trust is embedded in them. So I think that's exciting and positive.
Mm-hmm. There's certainly upsides to every situation if we look for them. Mohamed, I want to ask a little bit more, digging into the data on the institutions. So you mentioned the local businesses, local hospitals, local press. Those certainly had the highest levels of trust. And I guess my question is, I would imagine, tell me if I'm wrong here in my extrapolation, that both Republicans and Democrats seem to trust local officials, and then the schism starts when we're talking about national figures, whether it's someone in your data, you looked at Anthony Fauci, Andrew Cuomo, Mike Pence, Donald Trump, that those fissures really happen on a partisan front, looking at the national level. What does Gallup think or see in terms of what might be able to bridge that divide and bring people together and have more trust on a national level?
That's such a great question. It's like the $1 million question. Well, let me sort of actually tackle that from another data point that I think would also be really interesting for the audience and community of the Competitiveness Council. Every July, and hopefully we'll be doing it this July as well, we ask Americans about what makes them proud to be an American for 4th of July. Obviously, it's actually one of my favorite polls. Last year, when we updated those metrics, the things that garnered 9 in 10 Americans saying that this makes me proud to be American all had to do with innovation, business, technology, opportunity, and basically the private sector, quite frankly. The things that garnered the worst ratings were all national politics or things that have become politicized at a national level. So 6 in 10 Americans say that the political system in their country does not make them proud to be an American, which is a shocking statistic. So I think that, aside from attitudes about the media, there is a lot of reform, I think, that needs to happen. And it's clear in our data that people across the board want that. I think and this does tie into the media, what taints our national conversation, I think, are those kind of 20% on each far end that are very vocal, very ideological. We see them in our data set on pretty much every question you ask. But there is definitely a consensus in America on a couple of things. That the private sector is really where solutions are, and it's where people look for solutions. The other point is government structures that have more of a direct feedback mechanism, like local government, had historically and will probably continue to do much better around things like perceptions of corruption, and how sort of democratic those institutions are when you compare those local institutions to national ones. So there's a partisan element to it, but I think it also is a larger sort of transpartisan or beyond partisan dynamic to what could be, hopefully, who knows, a future of reform in some areas of national politics. One thing that's been fascinating to us is to poll people on the voting process. And being that COVID is now a major concern for many respondents, whether or not people are willing to vote by mail. And that's become a really controversial topic. Again, one of those kind of logistical topics that has become very politicized. We'll continue to poll on it, but I think the challenges up ahead are vast. The partisanship is unique for our time, but it's not unprecedented. I think that's important to remember. We can only, at Gallup, our job is to continue to track and report what's happening, and identify the partisan divides where they exist, but also identify where people agree. And I think reform in some of these areas is something that has supporters on both sides of the political divide. How we go about reforming, I think, differs greatly, of course.
Well, and that's a question for Deborah. So I can imagine that you and your members would be excited to hear that business, entrepreneurship, innovation, private sector are the shining lights, the post-partisan moments of celebration in America. So how do you square that with the thread of our earlier conversation about the national media? Do you think that the national media is, in some respects, exacerbating the partisan divide, Deborah? And then in terms of how business has been able to keep trust in spite of this social divide we're seeing politically, what advice do you have for the political world, lessons learned on how the political world can be more trusted?
Well, one thing I want to add as I get into that question, that building on Mo's wonderful comments from Gallup's work, is the other institution, of course, that he did not mention, but I know he'll want to now, that has high levels of trust, is our military. And when you see, I mean, I don't know how many people, watched any of the virtual celebrations and tributes this past Memorial Day, but they were very moving. And I watched the one on PBS, and it was very, very bipartisan. I mean, it was really thrilling to see great political leaders, national leaders from both parties and times and administrations, coming together to celebrate, our country's heritage and what we've done to preserve liberty and freedom, and just the power and glory of our military in a very positive, emotional way was really celebrated throughout the country on Memorial Day.
And certainly here on our panel, even Congressman Bergman, we will get into that. We're getting into those conversations with him about military, and he brings an expert voice on that.
So in terms of reform, I think that we are in a position right now, again, to identify some of the failings, some of the limitations in our private sector, government systems, and how we can propose and move forward with some very long overdue remedies to take us to a place to develop more inclusive prosperity and long-term growth and resiliency. So an example of this is, really looking at our regulatory environment in a new way. We know that regulations, for instance, enable business, and you can call them laws or procedures, whatever. I mean, from the time we've been human beings and lived in communities, we've had laws and things that somehow put markers and systems around our behavior and actions. We have a regulatory environment now in the United States that has grown and grown and grown. It's sort of a amoeba. And at the Council on Competitiveness through our National Innovation Commission, we're really systematically looking at what regulations need to be changed, modified to unleash this innovation capacity that will create the new products, the businesses, the services, and the entrepreneurship for the country. And again, I think we're ripe for that. Just to give you an example, in order for universities and businesses to really return full speed ahead, both physically and every other way, they're very concerned about liability now. What will happen, in a workplace environment if someone, becomes ill in the workplace and then says, well, my employer, whatever, didn't do the right thing. Many organizations, many studies for years have called for product liability reform in those laws. And again, I've heard from senators and members of Congress for both parties. They're now willing to look at that because of COVID-19. And so that's another positive example, of reform that needs to go forward. I think another area that we're going to be seeing is in some very new innovative things such as digital currency, digital dollar. We're all living in the digital world now. Yes, we're doing online banking and things, but I think we're going to see just a burst of innovation. Now, one area that I am concerned about, and everybody is, and we talked about that a little bit earlier with you, Carrie, is the security and verification of content in critical supply chains in the private sector. Everyone, rightly so, is very concerned about the extent to which our supply chain, everything from core feedstocks all the way up to finished products, got hollowed out in the United States for medicines, medical devices, supplies. And so how we're going to verify and rebuild those supply chains, that's going to take a lot of reform actions, both from the private sector and the government. There's a global race for a vaccine right now. And just since we spoke, there's been so much innovation in new vaccines here in the United States, in the UK, in Australia, Japan, as well as what's going on in China. Are people going to trust the integrity of the testing and what's in these new vaccines in order to be the first to put up their hand and say, I'm ready to take it? And we're seeing a lot of movement in the government to help the FDA and the other certification process to make sure we can have a safe, tested vaccine sooner than later to really ensure that our people and people around the world can move forward with their lives. So we're seeing lots and lots of reform driven by this tragedy of the global pandemic. And those are just a few examples.
Sure. Well, I'm sure you have many more, Deborah. We appreciate your time. We're going to have to leave it right there. Deborah and Mohamed, thank you so much for joining us here in this conversation on trust in the new COVID world.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.
I want to welcome now someone with real experience in what it's like to be a leader right now. Jack Bergman is not only a retired U.S. Marine Corps general, but he represents Michigan's 1st District in the U.S. House of Representatives, where he serves on both the Armed Services Committee and on the Committee on Veterans Affairs. Welcome, Congressman.
Great to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity.
So, Congressman, we just heard from Gallup, and it's probably no surprise to you that according to Gallup, among 12 institutions in a recent survey, Congress was ranked second to the bottom in terms of handling the response to the coronavirus. Now, the good news is that you guys in Congress beat the news media, my business, which came in dead last. Do you think that Congress has a trust problem when it comes to COVID-19?
Well, does Congress have a trust problem with COVID-19, or does Congress have a trust problem, period? I think that's probably a fair question to ask. Anytime we don't understand something, we fear it first. If something is out of the norm, and before we can develop the trust, we have to have some understanding of what is creating our fears. So the point is, what we're relying on, at least guys like me right now, are relying on the relationships that we already built here across the aisle. In fact, I just finished a little one-on-one with one of my Democrat colleague friends who came in as freshmen, and we were talking about the very subject of trust and how do we build the confidence in our fellow members of the House of Representatives that, unless they're feeling ill, that they should be confident to come back here to DC to do their work. But I would suggest to you the unknown is what limits our ability to trust.
And so, Congressman, you've led both personally in the military, and now you're leading here in civilian life. In fact, you flew helicopters in Vietnam, and you served as a 3-star general in the Marines. Has COVID changed anything about the way that you see your role as a leader?
Not really, because leaders have to be visible. They have to be confident. They have to know when it's time to step forward and when it's time to step back. And so this, in some ways, actually, for me personally, is a chance to utilize the leadership skills that I developed as a Marine in a different context, not in a uniform, but in a suit, where the hierarchy of command and the focus of mission is different than in a military unit. But it's giving me a chance one more time to lead in an environment where there's a lot of stress.
And in terms of, I remember you saying in another conversation that we had, you learned early on what you needed to learn from the Boy Scouts. Can you share with our viewers what that was?
I will. The best leadership advice I've ever received in my entire life. I was 15, and I was part of a 2-troop, 2-week encampment where we were the junior troop, and I was the assistant senior patrol leader. And the senior patrol leader, who was a sage 16-year-old, I was 15, called me into his tent when we first got there and said, "Bergman, life is not a popularity contest. Go out there and get the job done. Any questions?" And I've used that to this day. We have to get the job done, whatever that means, as the 435 elected members of the House of Representatives. And this is sometimes the challenge for all of us who try to get reelected, is to want to make sure we're popular enough to win reelection. But what is most important right now, especially, is to show our leadership and to show it's not about us, but it's about others, and it's about accomplishing our mission as Congress. And so, yeah, that leadership advice still holds. And I'm always nice to people, but I'm not really, concerned about my popularity.
Well, and I find that very interesting, Congressman, because institutional surveys of trust have also shown that the military ranks pretty high up there among institutions and how Americans view the military. So why do you think there seems to be this paradox? Because you mentioned that members of Congress and politicians, it's in their very nature to want to be popular because they want to be reelected, yet their ratings and popularity as an institution is almost rock bottom. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, training under stress goes a long way towards building a person's self-confidence and also building their leadership ability. So when you're in the military, or in a lot of situations, but let's just stick with the military here, we train under stress so that when the stress becomes real, the training really kicks in and you respond almost instinctively because this is not your first rodeo. For a lot of my colleagues, they've never been under any stress that they couldn't control before, like, let's say, COVID-19 and an invisible enemy. So they're not sure what to do first because they've never trained to be, shall we say, make decisions in a stressful environment and then be evaluated on those decisions.
So, Congressman, in terms of that same Gallup poll that we mentioned, it also found that Americans rated their own employers pretty high. 89% approval rating in April, which was actually up 7 points from March.
So this seems to be a bright spot here. Do you think that there are things that businesses are doing right in terms of gaining the trust of the American people?
I think as citizens who want to be informed, we want to see a 360-degree view of a subject. We want to see it from all sides. When you think about the number of people that you know that say, well, I only watch this media or only watch that media, or sometimes some of my friends will say, well, I have to switch back and forth to get a broader picture. What the American people really want is to see not all just the negatives. It's easy to point out, all the negatives. And I think people are quite honestly getting sick of hearing just the negatives. We'd like to hear, okay, I can accept bad news, but tell me some examples of what other countries have done for example, of responding to COVID-19. How is Italy doing these days? How is Spain doing? How is Sweden doing? Now all we hear, depending, is what is happening in South America, because that's where new outbreaks are. But I think people have lost faith in media because they don't believe the media is giving an unbiased look at what is really out there for information.
Now, Congressman, President Trump has been very vocal on a related note on the issue of social media. His administration has come out and said it wants regulation of social media giants like Facebook, Twitter, et cetera, saying that they are not being fair arbiters of freedom of speech and that there is anti-conservative bias in social media. What is your take on this?
Well, what's the historical phrase, we all live in interesting times. There are always interesting times, just depends on what time in history we're living. Number one, freedom of speech. We are a country that has freedom of speech, freedom of the press, where if anyone uses their media, social media, print media, whatever it happens to be, to slander, to create false information about someone, that is against who we are. And I believe that is, if you're going to do that behavior, then what's the old saying, if you can't do the time, don't do the crime. But the point is, we need to maintain free speech, but we also need to make sure that there are no restrictions on that freedom of speech, with probably one exception, and that is vulgarity and the use of language or images that we would not want our children, under a certain age to see or potentially be exposed to. But we need to make sure we maintain free speech, but also, again, it's upon everybody else to make sure everybody gets their fair, their fair share, if you will, of media exposure to counter what might be said against them. But that's the role of the media is extremely important in the freedoms of our country. They need to make sure that they don't put themselves into a position where they've abused it through the bias that's become a prejudice and trying to unduly influence people without being upfront about everything they're putting out there.
So, Congressman, the president has called himself a, quote, wartime president and has called the virus a, quote, invisible enemy. Congressman, you are the highest ranking combat veteran ever elected to Congress, so you would have a unique perspective on this analogy. Do you think it's helpful to think about leadership in this way right now?
Well, I tell you what, I like what the president's done. We all have our own methods and our own style, but he has stepped up to the plate to deal with the coronavirus and every other issue he's dealt with for the past 3.5 years as the president. Just think about how much more we could have accomplished as a country under his leadership if so many people hadn't spent so much time attacking him for personal reasons, nothing to do with his presidential duties, but just because it was personal for them. We've gotten so much done here in the U.S. Under his 3.5 years that he is in a war, and he's in a war with many fronts. One's an invisible enemy, Another is an enemy who's very visible, who started right after the election and before the inauguration of the resist movement, and all of those things, the Antifas and all those folks. That's not who we are as a country. And anybody who uses that kind of a tactic, shame on them, as my mother would have said.
Congressman, as this turns here with the coronavirus from a public health emergency to a more sustained economic crisis, do you think that the requirements for leadership change as well?
No, they really don't, because a leader is a leader. You just, the mission changes. You could be a leader in a, shall we say, off the battlefield. You're the leader of a training entity in the military, for example. You're not in the fight, but yet you're leading and training people to go to the fight. And then you could be a leader on the battlefield. So the need for leadership does not change. Leadership is always looking forward, looking to see what the mission is, what do you have for resources, what do you need, and how do you accomplish your mission. That never changes. And there are only 51 commanders-in-chief in the United States of America. There's the president, who's the commander-in-chief of the country, and there are the 50 governors, who are the commanders-in-chief of their states. That's how we were founded as a country. That's what the guys like Jefferson and Washington and all of those folks that we could name names believe that we're a country of states' rights, and that means that what we might do, let's say, because I live in Michigan, we might do it one way in Michigan, and they might do it a different way in Florida. That's fine. But we need a federal government leader, putting it back into where I am right here in my role. We need a leader like the president who has actually stepped up and said, you know what? I'm going to tackle these things, and I'm going to tackle them in my own way, based upon my own experience, and I'm going to work with others, whether it be the Senate, the House, Democrats, Republicans, and I'm going to work with them to get things done. Think about how much we could be doing if we weren't doing all this bickering based on partisan party politics.
So, Congressman, given the realities of political life in Washington right now, right in the middle of this presidential election year, how do we get people to work together on this to fight the coronavirus?
What I see here in Washington, D.C., I work every day across the aisle, bipartisan, Democrats and Republicans working together. We do a lot of work behind the scenes. We don't seek credit. We just go out and get the job done. So I believe our future as a country, we're going to be so much better because we've come through the corona pandemic, if you will, and we have the confidence to say, hey, guess what? That wasn't that bad. We came through it just like our ancestors came through a couple of world wars, Great Depression, Spanish flu, whatever it happens to be. This experience for us as Americans is going to be bonding rather than dividing. That's my prediction. But it's going to come because people start to talk to one another in such a way as find the commonalities rather than the differences. Good leaders take into consideration the safety and well-being of all of under their command, under their charge, and they have to make tough decisions. But wisdom is something that comes over time. It's not just something that's put into a welcome packet when you are sworn into a new position.
Well, thank you, Congressman. I think that you gave some great ideas on how people can get that welcome package by looking at your track record and following some of your advice that you gave us here today. Thank you, Congressman.
Thank you so much.
And thanks so much to all our guests. This has been Restoring Trust in Uncertain Times. To find out more about these issues, go to compete.org. There you can restream this program and find additional resources, including some of the papers and articles that we've discussed today. Until next time, for the Council on Competitiveness, Gallup, and our sponsor, Philip Morris, I am Carrie Sheffield, and thank you for watching.